China's economy is sending mixed signals. Industrial output is holding up, high-tech manufacturing is expanding. Some data is even beating expectations. And yet, China has set its growth target at just 4.5% to 5%, the lowest in decades. For an economy that once grew at double digits, this isn't just a slowdown, it's a reset. Because for decades, China had a reliable playbook. When growth weakened, it stimulated. When demand slowed, it invested. And each time, the system responded. But now, the same tools are producing smaller results. So the question is no longer whether China can grow. It's why the model that powered that growth is no longer working the same way. At the center of this shift is how China built its economy in the first place. Unlike consumption-driven economies, China's growth was engineered through investment. Infrastructure, real estate, industrial expansion, these weren't just byproducts of growth. They were the engine. State-controlled banks directed capital into large-scale projects. Local governments were incentivized to build roads, railways, housing, entire cities. And as long as investment kept expanding, growth followed. In simple terms, China didn't just grow by producing more. It grew by building more and borrowing to do it. That created a powerful cycle. Investment drove growth, growth increased asset values, rising asset values supported more borrowing, and that borrowing financed even more investment. As long as demand kept rising, the system sustained itself. But that model depends on one critical assumption, that each new investment continues to generate meaningful returns. And this is where the system begins to change. Over time, the returns on investment have started to decline. China has already built much of the infrastructure it needs. Entire regions face overcapacity in housing, in industry, even in transport networks. The result is that each new unit of debt generates less economic output than before. This is the definition of diminishing returns, and the data reflects it. Debt levels have continued to rise, with general government debt projected to exceed 102% of GDP in 2026, yet growth continues to slow. That gap between rising debt and slowing growth is the first sign that the model is under pressure. But it's not the only one. The property sector, which once anchored the entire system, is now reversing. Home sales are projected to fall between 10% and 14% in 2026. Prices are expected to decline by another 4%, and in some cases, property values have dropped below mortgage balances, leaving banks exposed to what are effectively underwater loans. This matters because real estate wasn't just another sector. It was a core transmission channel for growth. It supported local government revenues through land sales. It anchored household wealth, and it absorbed enormous amounts of credit. Now, instead of amplifying growth, it's dragging on it. At the same time, local governments, the very actors that drove investment, are under increasing financial strain. Despite a massive 10 trillion yuan debt substitution program, many regions are no longer expanding. They are refinancing. Interest payments alone are expected to consume around 5% of local government revenues. Budgets are increasingly allocated to servicing existing debt rather than funding new projects. In other words, the system that once pushed growth forward is now being used just to stabilize what already exists. And this is where a deeper constraint begins to emerge. Because when investment slows, the natural alternative is consumption. But China's economy has never been structured around strong consumer demand. Household savings remain high. Consumer confidence is uneven. Even as retail sales rose modestly by 2.8% in early 2026, that growth is not strong enough to replace the scale of investment-driven expansion, which raises a more important question. If investment is weakening and consumption isn't ready to take over, what replaces the engine of growth? Beijing's answer is increasingly clear: technology. The 15th five-year plan marks a deliberate shift towards what policymakers call high-quality growth. Instead of relying on construction and credit, the focus is now on innovation, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, hydrogen energy, and advanced manufacturing. These sectors are already showing momentum. High-tech industrial output is growing rapidly, Corporate profits among large industrial firms surged by over 15% in early 2026, and innovation-driven sectors now account for roughly 15% of GDP. But this transition introduces its own complexity, because while these industries are growing quickly, they are still relatively small compared to the scale of the traditional economy. They can enhance productivity, they can create new capabilities, but they cannot immediately replace the sheer volume of growth once generated by real estate and infrastructure. So the system enters a transitional phase. The old engine is slowing, the new engine is still scaling, and during that transition, growth naturally decelerates. At the same time, structural pressures are intensifying. China's population has declined for the fourth consecutive year, falling to 1.405 billion. The workforce is shrinking, the population is aging, and the old age dependency ratio is rising steadily. In simple terms, fewer workers are supporting more retirees. That increases the burden on healthcare systems, pension systems, and public finances, while reducing long-term growth potential. The labor market reflects this tension. Youth unemployment remains elevated at over 16%, even as a record 12.7 million graduates enter the workforce this year. This creates a mismatch, not just between jobs and workers, but between the economy's structure and its future needs. And these internal pressures are now colliding with a more complex external environment. Global trade is fragmenting. World trade growth is expected to reach just 0.5% in 2026, constrained by tariffs, industrial policies, and geopolitical tensions. More than 3,000 new trade measures were introduced globally in the past year alone, 3 times the level of a decade ago. For an export-driven economy, this matters. China is already adjusting. Exports to the United States have declined sharply, while shipments to the Middle East have grown significantly, particularly in sectors like automobiles and steel. But this shift doesn't fully offset the broader trend. Trade is becoming more political, more regional, and less predictable. At the same time, geopolitical risks are adding new layers of uncertainty. Roughly half of China's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a region recently affected by renewed instability. Disruptions have already led to spikes in energy prices, with local fuel costs rising by as much as 20% before government intervention. This creates a new type of pressure. Higher input costs feed into inflation, but lowering interest rates to support growth risk weakening the currency. So policymakers face a constraint. The central bank must balance between stimulating the economy and maintaining financial stability, and that balance is becoming harder to manage. Fiscal policy faces similar limits. Public expenditure is rising, expected to reach 30 trillion yuan in 2026. The government is issuing trillions in bonds to support infrastructure and strategic sectors. But as debt levels increase, each additional round of stimulus carries more risk and delivers less impact. This creates a structural tension. Stimulate too aggressively and financial risk rise. Hold back and growth slows further. There is no clean solution, only trade-offs. And this is what makes the situation difficult to fix, because the issue is not a single sector, not a single policy, not a temporary shock. It's the interaction of multiple systems under pressure. An investment model facing diminishing returns, a financial system carrying rising debt, a demographic structure that is reversing, a global environment that is becoming less supportive, and a transition toward a new growth model that takes time to build. When viewed together, these pressures reveal something more fundamental. China is not just managing a slowdown. It is attempting to rebalance an entire economic system, from investment to consumption, from expansion to efficiency, from scale to sustainability. But transitions like this are inherently slow. They require shifting incentives, restructuring industries, and rebuilding confidence, both domestically and internationally. And during that process, growth becomes harder to sustain, not because the economy is failing, but because the old drivers are no longer dominant and the new ones are not yet fully in place. Which leads to the deeper reality behind all of this. China's challenge isn't cyclical, it's structural. The model that powered decades of rapid growth, debt-driven investment at massive scale, has reached its limits. And replacing that model is not a matter of policy adjustment, it's a matter of transformation. The broader implication extends beyond China itself, because for years, global growth has been closely tied to China's expansion through trade, commodities, supply chains, and capital flows. As China transitions, those global dynamics begin to shift as well. Slower, more complex, more uncertain, and that reframes the original question. The issue is no longer whether China can return to its previous growth rates, but whether it can successfully build a new system, one capable of sustaining growth under very different conditions. Because what's unfolding is not just a slowdown, it's the gradual unwinding of one of the most powerful economic models of the modern era, and the uncertain process of replacing it. If this changed how you see China's economic trajectory, like and subscribe. And if you want to understand what comes next for the global economy, click the video on your screen.